In this video, we'll talk about how to manage states in React. We'll also mention a few tips and tricks about using JavaScript along the way. So React lets us build UI using components. This concept is not new. We could use components like buttons and panels to build GUI for desktop applications, since desktop applications first had GUI. Now we are just using React to do the same, except that now the application is written in JavaScript and runs inside the browser. One thing React lets us to do is to create custom components that combine the basic components provided by HTML, like buttons, input fields, and so on. If you remember, in the guestbook example, we basically created one component for each page. For example, we had a guestbook component showing everything on the guestbook main page and the add comment component showing the add comment form. You may be wondering, is this the right approach? Or shall we break a page down into smaller components? The answer, as most things, is it depends. The advantage of using a big component, like a component for a whole page, is that it's easier to implement. All the data, tags, styles, event handlers, and so on are in the same place, and you don't need to worry about the interactions between components. The downside is that the component is likely not reusable, because it's unlikely that you'll have another page that looks exactly the same. The arguments for breaking a page down into smaller components are the opposite. The smaller components are likely to be more reusable somewhere else, but the implementation will be more complex because you have to deal with the interactions between components. So basically, it comes down to reusability. If something can be reused somewhere else, you should make it into a component. Otherwise, just use a big component for a whole page, like in the guestbook example. Now, let's consider the case where we do have multiple components for a page. Like the DOM tree for an HTML page, the components also form a tree structure where a parent component contains several child components, and a child component can have its own child components, and so on. In this video, we'll focus on how we manage states in a component tree. We'll use something like this as an example. You probably saw something like this before. For example, when somebody reviews a video game, they may rate the game in several categories, like story of the game, gameplay, graphics, and sound. Another example would be after you receive some service, you may get a survey from the service company asking you to review the technician in terms of timeliness, professionalism, competency, and so on. If you look at this, it seems to make sense to create a component for the rating part because it's repeated several times. And then we can create another component for the whole review, which contains a total plus a few rating components. So here's my rating component. By the way, I created this rating component in a newly created React app. Haven't changed anything else yet, just adding this new rating component. So first of all, it's a function component called rating. It takes an object for properties, and we are going to keep the rating value in a state called the rating with initial value 1, and set rating is of course the setter function for changing the rating. And instead of using fancy stars like this, we are going to use just buttons. For our purpose, the pretty, whether it's being pretty or not, is not too important. We want to focus on the function and code. So I have an array of functions here, array of buttons here originally is empty, and depending on the maximum rating, notice that we are going to have a property called max rating, and based on that we create a number of buttons, and each button will have a key. This is required by React so that we don't get the warning about some collection having no key. And then if the button's value matches the current rating, we set the background to red. So here, notice that how we set the style attribute of element. We are familiar with how to set style in CSS, where we just use a string and say, for example, background red, something like this. But in JSX, to set the style attribute, we should use an object, and each object property would be a style rule. For example, here I have a property called background, and the value being red, meaning that it will apply the red background to this button if the button matches the rating. If it does not, and we simply set no style or empty object. And if somebody clicks on the button, we have an event handler here that says the rating or change the rating to whatever value represented by that button, and that button will have a text which shows its value, and after this button element is created, we put it inside the array. And for display, we'll just display the name, which again, notice that it's a property of props object, meaning that we'll have another property called name, and that corresponds to this part. And then the array of buttons. And at the end, we export this component. So now we have that component. Let's put it to work. So this is, again, a newly created React app. Let's remove everything in here. And let's import our rating component. So it will be inside components. And it's called rating. And we'll say import rating from that. And then here, we are simply going to render the rating component. We'll pass two properties to it. One is the name, and one is the max rating. So name doesn't really matter. Let's say we'll pass a name called gameplay to it. And the max rating, let's say the max rating is 10. So now we have that. If we I think I forgot to import use state here, so let's do that. Let's import use state from React. And okay, so now our rating component is displayed here. It has a maximum of rating 10, and the initial rating value is 1, so the first button is highlighted or with red background. If I click on 5, 5 has a red background, and so on. Again, it's not as fancy as those stars, but it gets the job done. Okay, so this is our component, and there's nothing new here yet. We saw all this in our previous videos. The only thing I want to change for this part is properties, or the properties parameter for the component. Notice that when we pass a properties object like this, it's rather difficult to see exactly what properties this component uses. You'll have to read through all the code and look for props.something, props.something in order to find out what properties this component uses. We can improve this by using the destructuring syntax in JavaScript. We have talked about destructuring syntax in JavaScript before. For example, here we are actually using it. UseState returns an array of 2 items. We assign those 2 items to 2 variables called rating and setRating using the destructuring syntax. And this same syntax works for objects. For example, if we have an object with 2 properties x and y, we can assign it to 2 variables x and y like this. And this works kind of the same way with arrays. So knowing that, we can apply the same thing to function parameters and arguments as well. Notice that this function takes an object as an argument, so we can destructure that object into 2 variables, name and max rating. And then inside our code, we can then use those directly like this. And now it becomes much more clear what properties this function component uses. And even better, with this syntax, we get the added benefit of being able to set default values. For example, we can then set a default value of 10 to max rating, and then if it happens to be the default value, we no longer need to set it because it gets the default. So this is the first trick of today, destructuring in function parameters. Okay, so all in all, this is our rating component. Again, nothing new yet other than this destructuring trick. Now let's build the review component. So the review component will have a total, which is a h2 element plus 4 rating components. So let's build that, and I'm going to put it under components folder as well, and it's going to be called review.js, and we'll have function.review, and does it have any properties? Maybe not. We'll leave it there for now, and this one will, let's say, return h2 called total. Now exactly how to get total we don't know yet. We'll figure that out. And then we want to have 4 rating components. In order to do that, let's specify an array of categories so that we don't have to list them individually. And the categories will be, let's say, story, gameplay, and graphics, and sound. Notice that we can even make this review component more customizable by putting the categories as the properties. But let's keep things simple and just hard code the categories inside the component. It's trivial to move them to properties if we want. So now once we have these categories, then we need to use them to produce 4 rating components. And let's import rating first. We'll say import rating from rating. and then we'll do a map. We'll say categories map, and for each category we'll return a rating, and the name of the rating will be category, and we probably want to have a key for that, and let's also call it category, and that's pretty much it, right? It looks like it. We'll find out. And yeah, so max rating will have a default, and this looks like it. And then we export default review, and okay, so then instead of creating a rating here, we'll create a review here. We'll import review instead. Don't need this, and we'll put reviews. Okay, so let's look at what it looks like. Rating is not defined. Okay, so now we have our review component, and so each individual rating still works, so that's good. And we also have story, gameplay, graphics, and so on. So far so good. Now, except one thing, we don't have the total, right? So the question is, how do we get the total when the states are kept in each individual rating? The first thing you may be thinking is that we can probably read the state in each of the child rating component and add them together. But there are two problems. First, access state in a child component is not recommended. You can do it if you really want to, but in general you shouldn't. Secondly, when the state of a child component is changed, the child component gets re-rendered, but not the parent component. That means, for example, even if you can read the states in the child components and get a total, but whenever a user change a rating, the child component gets re-rendered and reflect the change, but the parent won't get re-rendered, so you will still see the old total. The solution to that is this. We want to put the states in the parent component. As shown in this picture, if all the components in a component tree need to access a state, you should put it in the root of the tree. Now here I use the term component tree here, but it applies to subtrees as well. If you have a large component tree where only a few components share state, you would want to put the state at the root of the subtree that contains those components, not the root of the whole tree. In any case, the data in the states will be passed down from parent to children as properties of the children. And because a component cannot change its properties, we'll also need to pass down event handlers, which will bring the changes back up to the root, so the states can be changed. Now, let's see how it can be done for our example. So, instead of keeping ratings, states in rating, now we are going to keep states in the parent. That means the parent will pass down a rating property and that will be used inside the component. So that part is still the same. Now we'll also need to change this part because this component no longer has a set rating. We'll do that in a moment. Now, as we just mentioned, states will be kept in the root, or in this case, the parent node review. So let's import use state from React. And then we'll have something like this. We'll say ratings, set ratings, use state, and then 1, 1, 1, 1, assuming that we still have the same 4 categories. So now the parent node keeps the ratings of each child, and it's in a ratings array initially with 4 ones, and a setter that later on we'll use to change the states. Now, to get the total, we can then simply add up the ratings. If you remember, we did an exercise on using the reduce method in array. So we can do the same thing here. We can simply do ratings reduce, and then to reduce it to a sum, we'll do something like previous, current. Come on, stop giving me tips. And it will reduce to previous plus current, and something like this. Again, if we run into an error, we'll fix it. So this gives us a sum of the array using the very convenient reduce method. And then we'll need to change this a little bit. Let's put the parentheses around it first. And let's change. We still have the key. We still have the name. And now we need to have now we need to pass the rating to it as well. Now the rating is one of the values in this ratings array. That means to take that rating out, we'll need an index. So we'll use the second argument for the map callback. This one will give us an index, and this one will say ratings index, something like this. Yeah, something like this. So this would allow this component to get a rating property. Now, we still need to be able to change the state when a user clicks on this component. And that's where we pass the event handler. So we can create an event handler property. The name doesn't really matter. So here I'll call it onRatingChange. And this one will take a new rating. Yeah, this one will take a new rating. And what this one does is, okay, so it will need to do a little bit more work here. So we need to get the current ratings, and we need to make a copy of it. Okay, so we'll do something like this. We'll say let new ratings is ... ratings. Okay, so this is a current ratings array, and we cannot just simply set the value into the ratings array, because we have to use set ratings to change states. Otherwise, React will not be aware of the change, and all the effort is for naught. So we will need to make a copy of the array and then change the value in the copy and then set a new copy back to states using set settings. Now, this is the second trick of the day, the spread syntax. This is a fairly common way to make a copy of an array. So you just specify the array, spread it out, and then put it inside a new array. And the new array will have all the elements of the old array as a copy rather than the array itself. So once we have that, then we can change the value inside the new array to the new rating, and then we can use the set ratings to set the new ratings back to the states. So something like this. Now, this will be a function or event handler passed to this, and so we'll add rating change as a property here, and then here when somebody click on it, we'll say rating change and pass it the value of the button. So let's see if it works. Okay, so let's see if it works. Looks like it's working. We already got the total, which is 4, which means our reduce method call seems to be working. If I click 6, now it's increased to 9, click 5, becomes 13. So it's working. That's great. Now, moving on. Before we move on, so this is the most common and most basic way to handle states in a React component tree. So you need to be very comfortable doing this if you want to program React a lot. Now, with that said, sometimes things do get more complicated when you have a large component tree. The first problem is that you may have states in multiple subtrees. It will be difficult to figure out what the states the whole component tree is in when you have states in all kinds of different places. And secondly, if the tree is tall, it's quite tedious to pass down states and then event handlers all the way from the root to a leaf. Conceptually, you can imagine that it would be nice to kind of take the states out of the tree and make them available to all the components that need them. Some components may need to use the data, and some components may change the data, and they can do it directly instead of going all the way back to the root. There are 2 common solutions for this. One is a React built-in feature called React Context, and the other is a third-party solution called Redux. React Context was added to React pretty late. I think it was introduced together with function components. Before that, people mainly used Redux. In this video, we'll use React Context because it comes with React, so there's no need for an additional dependency. But even more importantly, I think React Context is easier to use than Redux. Simplicity is a very important thing in software development. We never want to be more complex than necessary. So as I mentioned, React Context is quite easy to use. You use create context to create a context, and then you associate some data with the context using the context.provider component. context.provider wraps around the component tree that needs to access the data. Then every component in the tree can use context to get the data. Two things to note here. First, we can put states in the data object here. But remember that states should only be changed using those state setter functions. If you only put states in the context, all the components can read the states, but they cannot change the states. If you want some components to be able to change states, you need to put the state setter functions in the context as well. Second thing here is that states needs to be kept in an ancestor of this component tree, not the root component in the tree anymore, because we have to put the states and the state setters in the context provider, which becomes a parent of this new root. So states have to be taken out of the root and put it somewhere higher in the component tree. Okay, so knowing what we know, let's change our example to use React context. And so we'll first of all take this one out of the current root of our subtree review and put it here. And also inside app, we'll want to create a context provider, and so on and so forth. Now, this context will later on be used in the components as well, so we'll have to export this thing. So we'll first import create context from React, and then we'll export, let's create a context called the review context, and we'll say create context. Then inside here, we will need to wrap this thing around review context provider, and the value will be, we'll need to put two things into the value. We'll need to put the ratings as well as the setter to change ratings, and we'll wrap this thing around the review. Okay, so yeah, so this looks like it. And then inside review, what do we do? Inside review, we will need to import the review context. We'll say import review context from app, and then here we'll need to get the ratings and set ratings from use context. Okay, so we'll need to import use context from React as well. We'll say use context and review context. So this is basically accessing what's stored in the review context. Again, notice that this is a destructuring assignment where we take the data object and then assign it to two variables, ratings and set ratings. So in here, we actually do not need to have set ratings because we don't change ratings directly in the review component. We do need the ratings values in order to get the total. So we keep this, we keep all this. We don't keep this anymore, or do we? We don't need to keep this anymore because the rating component can get its rating from the context itself. But in that case, we do need to pass an index to it. So let's change this to passing the index to the component, to the rating component. And we no longer need to pass an event handler because the rating component can change states directly. Okay, so now our review component becomes like this. And we do the same thing for ratings. And here we will import use context. And here we will get the ratings and stuff. Okay, so what do we need to change here? We no longer need the rating, but we do have a new index property, so we'll use that. And we no longer need the event handler from parent. So we'll still have our buttons, and the button will still have this key. Okay, so we need to get this rating. And this rating now is rating index. So we get all the ratings, and this index property tells us which one we should get. So then what happens if we click on it? Well, we do kind of the same thing like before. We do kind of the same thing like before, and that means we need to create a new ratings array, which is ... ratings. And then we say new ratings index is the current button value, and then we set the ratings back. We say set ratings, new ratings, something like this, and the rest should be the same. Again, we'll find out. Okay, so refresh. Use state is not defined, and okay, so we'll need to import use state, and what else? Review context is not defined. Oh, okay, so we need to import review context like this one. And what else? Let's refresh it. Cannot read property reduced of undefined. So we're not getting ratings. It said this one is undefined. Why is that? Oh, somehow this thing as parenthesis. So it should be curly braces. Now notice that here there are double curly braces, and it's really not something special. Remember, one pair of curly braces let us to write a JavaScript expression, and then inside that, this one is a JavaScript object, consists of two properties, ratings and set ratings. So we'll see double curly braces is not some special syntax, it's just JavaScript, and then inside JavaScript, JavaScript object. So hopefully this one, it will work. Okay, so it seems to be working, and let's try 5, it changes to 8, 5 changes to 12. Okay, so it's now indeed working, and it's working with React context now. Okay, so this is pretty much it for this video. To learn more about state management in React, please check out Chapter 6 of Learning React 2nd edition. And this is the last video of the course. Hope you enjoyed the course and learned something. Good luck with your finals. Bye.